The void was silent, but silence in space had always been deceptive. It was the silence of impending chaos, the quiet before the fire. At the edge of human-controlled space, where Terran sovereignty stretched like a thin thread against the overwhelming tide of the cosmos, a storm was coming. The Va'Kor Imperium had declared war, and in their arrogance they sent a fleet of 1,000 warships to raze the frontier world of Harrow's reach. It was not an invasion. It was an execution. The Terran Dominion had faced annihilation before, but never on such a scale. This time the enemy did not come to negotiate or intimidate. They came to burn, to erase humanity from the stars with overwhelming force. The Dominion High Command scrambled for solutions, calculating fleet movements, logistics, and survival probabilities. Every simulation ended in disaster. Outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched, except for one man, one plan. Admiral Kael, the Crimson, Reaper Voss. He did not order a counter-armada. He did not convene a war council. He did not send envoys to beg for time. He sent one ship. The ISS Revenant, an enigma among warships, vanished into the black. Those within the Dominion who still held to reason thought it was a bluff, a last-ditch psychological maneuver, a futile show of defiance before the inevitable. Then, the message came. One warning. No elaborate speech, no grandstanding. Just a simple, unyielding transmission to the Va'Kor Imperium. Turn back now. This is your only chance. The Va'Kor High Command laughed. The fools. The humans had always been unpredictable, but this? One man, one ship. Against 1,000. There was no strategy that could turn the tide, no weapon powerful enough to tilt the balance. The order was given, ignore the warning, proceed with annihilation. The Revenant was waiting. The Revenant was unlike any warship the Dominion had ever built, an apex predator lurking in the cold abyss. It was not the largest ship, nor the most heavily armed, but it was designed for one purpose: asymmetrical warfare on an apocalyptic scale. Its hull was cloaked in adaptive plating, its engines silent in the void. It did not charge into battle. It slithered, unseen, unfelt, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Within its command bridge, Kael Voss stood alone, surrounded by screens displaying the endless fleet of the Va'Kor, a behemoth of arrogance. His fingers hovered over the control console, his expression unreadable, his mind calculating the inevitable. The Dominion had called him a madman. The Va'Kor believed him a ghost story. Both were correct. The fleet was nearly upon Harrow's reach when the first anomaly occurred. Small at first, the leading ships experienced sensor glitches, then minor system failures. Targeting arrays flickered, relays refused to respond. The Va'Kor dismissed it as background interference until ships began disappearing. It was not destruction in the conventional sense. There was no explosion, no sign of attack. Entire ships simply vanished from the battle network, as though swallowed by the void itself. Panic rippled through the armada. Frantic voices filled the Va'Kor command channels, captains screaming at one another as their ships began misfiring, their formations unraveling. Then, the whisper came. Not a voice over comms, not a message through transmission, but a calculated, directed intrusion into their neural interfaces. This is your fault. For the first time, the Va'Kor felt something they had never known in war. Doubt. Admiral Voss watched from the bridge, detached, analytical. The Revenant was not simply a warship. It was an illusionist, a harbinger of psychological terror. Cloaked beneath layers of electronic warfare, it moved between the Va'Kor formations like a phantom, striking with precision. One by one, ships lost their command functions, turned against each other, their own targeting systems corrupted. The fleets might have become its greatest liability. In the span of an hour, 40 ships were lost, not to enemy fire, to themselves. Those who attempted to flee found their jump drives mysteriously inoperable, navigation systems whispering lies into their displays. Some captains, once unbreakable, began abandoning their posts, fearing that the ship they commanded had already been cursed beyond salvation. The High Command screamed for order, but order was no longer an option. The Va'Kor were warriors of brute force, of numbers, of sheer overpowering strength. But they had never fought against something they couldn't see, against an enemy that struck at the very foundation of their certainty. Kael Voss leaned forward, the glow of the interface reflecting in his cold, calculated gaze. He had not come to fight them. He had come to break them. Then, the final message came. A last merciless echo before annihilation. You were warned. And in the heart of the enemy fleet, the first warship exploded. The first explosion rippled through the Va'Kor fleet like the opening note of a funeral dirge. What should have been the detonation of a single warship became a cascading chain reaction, sending shockwaves across the void. Their own weapons, their own energy signatures, had been turned against them. In the command bridge of the Revenant, Kael Voss remained unmoving, eyes cold as the abyss. His fingers drummed against the console, watching the frantic chaos unfold across the tactical displays. 1,000 warships had entered the system with arrogance, with the certainty of victory. They were already losing, and they didn't even know how. The Va'Kor High Commander Gethrin Varlock had been a veteran of 100 campaigns, a conqueror who had shattered fleets and razed worlds, but never before had he seen ships destroyed without a visible enemy. He barked orders in his guttural tongue, commanding his fleet to regroup, to find the phantom that haunted them. But it was not a phantom. It was a mind, a predator that had studied them long before they had arrived. Then the whisper returned, weaving through the encrypted Va'Kor battle network, bypassing every security protocol, bleeding into their systems like a living entity. You were warned. It was not spoken through comms. It was not transmitted through conventional means. It appeared inside their helmets, inside their minds. Panic took root. Crews screamed at their systems, trying to override the corruption. Weapons refused to fire. Targeting systems turned on their own ships. More captains made the mistake of opening fire blindly, only to strike down their own allies. And then, as if the universe itself had turned against them, the stars disappeared. The Revenant had activated its jamming array, a field of utter, consuming blackness that swallowed everything in a crushing void. No light, no sensors, no way to tell friend from foe. Voss did not need firepower. He only needed fear, a single transmission, this time open to the entire fleet, in the cold, clinical voice of the Crimson Reaper himself. Tell me, Va'Kor, how does it feel to know that your gods will not save you? The silence that followed was more terrifying than the explosions. This was not war. This was slaughter. The battlefield was no longer a field at all. It was a void of shifting reality, where terror held dominion over logic. The Va'Kor fleet, once an unshakable armada, now spiraled into fragmentation. Their captains unable to discern enemy from ally, their formations shattered, their discipline eroded. The Revenant had not fired a single main cannon, yet over 100 ships had already fallen, destroyed by their own fear, their own mistakes, their own desperation. The High Commander's command deck was a cacophony of screams and static, as officers across the fleet barked contradicting orders. One section demanded retreat. Another called for a blind counterattack. Others simply begged for guidance. But there was no guidance, no chain of command left uncorrupted. Kael Voss had seen it before. The moment when an enemy, so sure of their own superiority, broke under the weight of their own hubris. He had engineered this scenario dozens of times, but never on such a scale. He watched as massive warships drifted aimlessly, their engines failing, their shields faltering. A destroyer attempted to jump to light speed, only for its core to detonate, taking 3 other vessels with it. And yet, the Revenant remained unseen. It did not strike like a hammer. It unraveled the enemy like a slow, surgical incision, cutting deeper with every second. Then, a desperate move. The Warbringer, the Va'Kor fleet's flagship, surged forward, a behemoth of a warship, its hull gleaming crimson with battle sigils, its command crew the most unbreakable warriors of the Imperium. It alone had resisted the madness. It alone had retained its battle systems. It alone still had enough firepower to annihilate an entire planet in a single strike, and it had a target: Harrow's Reach. A planetary siege cannon, one capable of obliterating continents, came to life, charging with a low, ominous hum. Voss's expression remained unreadable. He had let them think they had a chance. He let them rally, let them regain hope. Because hope made the breaking all the sweeter. The Warbringer's cannon fired, a searing, white-hot lance of plasma aimed at the world below, an execution shot. And then it simply stopped. Suspended. Frozen in space mid-discharge, on board the Warbringer, panic surged. The cannon was active, but the energy remained locked in place as if time itself had refused to obey. And then the bridge lights flickered. Something was aboard the Warbringer. Something had infiltrated its systems. Something was watching. Kael Voss tilted his head, analyzing the data. The virus had worked faster than expected. The Warbringer's own weapon had been rewritten, hijacked, reprogrammed against them. He let them understand their fate before delivering the final message. You were given one warning. The cannon's plasma blast, still frozen in space, reversed collapse, collapsing back into the Warbringer's core, engulfing the entire flagship in a silent, blinding inferno. The High Commander did not even have time to scream. The Warbringer, the last hope of the Va'Kor, was no more. The Va'Kor fleet, leaderless, broken, consumed by terror, fled. 1,000 warships had come. Only a few dozen survived to tell the tale. And in the blackness, amidst the wreckage and the silence, the Revenant remained. Watching. Waiting. Because this was just the beginning. The silence after the Warbringer's destruction was deafening across the shattered remains of the Va'Kor fleet. What was once an overwhelming force had been reduced to aimless wreckage, broken steel drifting through the void like the remnants of a failed prophecy. They had come as gods. They now fled. As prey on board the Revenant, Kael Voss did not celebrate. This was not a victory, this was a lesson. One he had ensured would be carved into the Va'Kor's very existence for generations to come. Yet, there were still those who refused to accept the truth. A last cluster of Va'Kor warships, fewer than 100 but still armed, still defiant, attempted to regroup at the system's edge. Their desperation was palpable, cornered animals realizing too late that they were the ones being hunted. One last transmission flickered into the Dominion's network. Not from fear, not from surrender, but from rage. "We do not yield to ghosts," the message spat, filled with fury, with something close to madness. "You think you have broken us? We are Va'Kor. We—" The signal cut off mid-sentence. Kael had heard enough. He exhaled slowly, his fingers hovering over the controls, a quiet executioner in the void. The Revenant systems pulsed, unleashing its final act of war. The remnants of the Va'Kor fleet, their engines suddenly seized, their communications reduced to nothing but agonized static, found themselves frozen in space, caught in the grip of something they could not understand, could not fight, could not resist. Kael's voice came through their remaining systems, no longer a whisper, no longer a warning. Strength does not come from numbers. The first ship imploded, crushed, from within. Power does not come from gods. Another warship turned against its own, its crew screaming as their controls refused their pleas for mercy. Survival is not a birthright. The final remaining Va'Kor vessel, its hull covered in the blood of its own fleet, was left alone. Its engines failing, its weapons dead, its crew forced to watch as the void swallowed everything they had once believed in. Kael Voss let the silence hang for a moment longer. Then, he let them go. That single ship, crippled, terrified, alone, would return to the Imperium. It would carry the truth to its leaders, to its people, that humanity was not to be trifled with, that the Crimson Reaper had sent one warning, and there would not be another. The battlefield was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. Harrow's reach, once marked for annihilation, remained untouched beneath the cold watch of the Revenant. The planet's defense systems, which had braced for their final stand, now stood silent. The sky was clear, save for the drifting wreckage of what had once been the unstoppable force of the Va'Kor Imperium. The remnants of the enemy fleet had fled into the dark, scattered, broken, haunted. But one remained, a single, shattered warship limping toward Va'Kor space, carrying with it the tale of their humiliation. On board the Revenant, Kael Voss did not watch them leave. He did not need to. The lesson had been delivered. The war had never truly begun, because he had ensured there was no war left to fight. The bridge was still, the ambient glow of tactical displays casting long shadows across the room. His officers, hardened veterans of the Dominion, stood in silence. They had followed orders. They had carried out the impossible. But now, in the aftermath, there was no celebration, only questions. For all their victories, for all their resilience, had they become the very terror they once feared? One officer finally spoke, their voice careful. Was it necessary? Voss's response was measured, emotionless. Yes. But somewhere, in the depths of his mind, he knew the question would linger. Not just for them, but for him. As the Revenant drifted through the ruins of the battle, a final transmission pulsed through the Dominion network. A message, simple, undeniable, sent to every power that lurked in the shadows beyond human space. We are not prey. Humanity had not just survived. It had sent a warning to the stars, and the stars would never forget. The wreckage of the Va'Kor fleet drifted in the silence of the void, a grim monument to arrogance and defeat. Across the Dominion, news of the battle spread like wildfire. One ship, one warning, one legend. For the first time in recorded history, the great Va'Kor Imperium, conquerors of 1,000 worlds, had fled. But far beyond the borders of Dominion space, in the shadows of the galactic stage, others had been watching. In a darkened chamber deep within an unknown sector, a silent council gathered, their forms obscured, their voices hushed with intrigue and unease. Humanity had been a curiosity, an anomaly, a minor player in the grand balance of power. Not anymore. A transmission pulsed through the dark network of an unseen force, encoded and ancient, sent to those who had remained hidden. It was not a warning. It was an invitation. The humans have revealed their teeth. The Reaper walks among the stars. It is time to decide. Are they to be feared or destroyed? Deep within the Revenant, Kael Voss sat alone in his quarters, gazing into the endless night beyond his viewport. He knew this was not the end. The Va'Kor had been dealt a lesson, but in doing so he had drawn the gaze of something far greater. The game had changed. The next war had already begun, and this time, humanity would not be the ones waiting in the dark.